Well, hello, how's it going?
Morning.
Morning. I know on such a beautiful day, it's always hard to be inside, but at least we have windows, so we have a little bit of a hint of what we're missing out on. So I'm gonna keep this pretty casual today. I was really lucky to do some research the past semester on reproductive rights and justice for women in Palestine, an intersection of two issues I believe are really important. As an activist on Drake's campus, you've probably seen me around, I have done quite a bit of work on women's rights issues and also quite a bit of work on the rights of Palestinians living under occupation. Oddly enough, prior to this research, I had not done a lot on the way that these two issues intersect. So this project was really an exploration of how women's rights and Palestinian rights connect, how they work together, and the unique experiences of Palestinian women living under occupation and how that ties in to their reproductive experience. So the purpose of this research is really to make a case for the intersectionality of women's rights and the rights of Middle Eastern activists as well. Our causes are often not connected, and so I'm really trying to make a case for why we should be invested in the struggles of others. Feminists should be invested in the rights of Palestinians living under occupation, and pro-Palestinian activists should be invested in the rights of women, especially as it applies to women in areas of conflict. There's a lot of crossover, and I think that this research really makes a case for why it's important that we're examining both in a comparative lens. So for a lot of the research, I looked at why gender matters in areas of conflict, kind of more broadly. Particularly in Palestine, Abu Dhan, who wrote a very interesting research paper on motherhood as an act of defiance in Palestine. In contemporary Palestinian society, reproductive rights of women were instrumental in the process of reproducing the Palestinian nation. In this way, women are more than just individuals involved in the conflict, but they're also used as instruments of the conflict and can use their own powers and their own abilities to reproduce the nation. This puts women in a very unique perspective because it tasks them with the job of fulfilling the state. So, you know, if everybody dies, the state doesn't continue. And so women are tasked with reproducing the nation as a whole. And that's very interesting because in a lot of situations, the state uses them negatively, uses their bodies as reproducers and not as individuals with human rights who have basic tenets of humanity that need protected. So kind of the main starting point of my research was looking at the way that motherhood and gender are dealt with in times of conflict, and a lot of times they're not dealt with very well. When a state is focusing the majority of its research on dealing with conflict, on dealing with opposition, they often don't have a lot of time to focus on discussion and debate of women's rights. They tend to have very low numbers of basic reproductive capacities, including rights to contraceptives, rights to sexual education, and maternal and high maternal fatality rates. So looking more into this research, I found myself both surprised and not surprised at all. In times of conflict, especially in more traditional societies, motherhood is seen as an essential role because when you fail to have sufficient government institutions, the family often provides a lot of those services. So in more traditional societies, the family is your social safety net, which means that the role of the mother is much more traditional, which often does interfere with reproductive rights for women. So my goal in looking at all of this is to address long-standing reproductive barriers in the context of a human rights crisis. And basically what I found was that relatively little research has been done on this issue due to the political contentiousness of both sides. Well, there were research papers focused on individualistic aspects, so research papers on contraceptive availability in Palestine. There was little to do with the overall rights situation and why that matters to both sides. And so this research is really tasked with crossing that bridge. So the first major issue that I grew of interest was the danger of checkpoints. So this is something that's incredibly unique to Palestine. So if you don't have a strong understanding of the conflict, One thing to know is that Palestine does currently have a segregated road system enforced by the Israeli Defense Force. Basically what this means is if you have an Israeli driver's plate on the back of your car, you can drive on certain highways. If you have a Palestinian, you can drive on others. And it's very difficult to cross between. The other issue with this is that the system of illegal settlements that have been built into the West Bank have made it very difficult for individual Palestinians to travel, to get to school, to get to hospitals. And this has really massive ramifications for women who are pregnant, who are expecting, or who just need to access basic reproductive rights, even if they aren't expecting. And so the inability to move freely really does provide a hurdle for Palestinian women who are seeking to receive care. So here are some statistics that I think are pretty representative of the specific challenges that Palestinian women face. 10% of pregnant Palestinian women labored at checkpoints, resulting in 35 miscarriages and 5 maternal fatalities. And this was between 2000 and 2007, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. So basically what the statistic tells us is that a lot of times when you're trying to reach a hospital, you cannot easily reach a hospital, which results at a lot of labor occurring at military checkpoints. The important thing to note is that military checkpoints are not built for women in labor or for people who are seeking medical needs. So because of the high requirements of identification, of certain zoning, and sometimes military checkpoints are closed permanently and nobody can pass, there are very, very significant hurdles for women, especially in times of crisis when they're in labor. Additionally, the fact that 35 miscarriages and 5 maternal fatalities occurred has not yet affected the way that military checkpoint policies work. So today, women still cannot pass if they're in labor. There's no expedited role for them to get through. They have to wait in the same process as everyone else. Imagine being at a TSA checkpoint when you're about to give birth and not being able to budge the line. That's kind of what the situation is like. And obviously it has very, very intense ramifications. Many deaths of potential children and deaths of the mother as well. The next statistic that I wanted to bring up is that 1/5 of all pregnant women in Gaza and the West Bank could not receive prenatal care because of the difficulty in traveling through checkpoints. And this was according to the United Nations Population Fund. So this is a more general issue in Palestine. A lot of times, as I mentioned before, the barriers to getting kind of around military checkpoints makes it very difficult to receive even the most basic of health care. Because of this, most Palestinian women don't have the opportunity to receive prenatal care. In the US, obviously, we have a pretty expansive system of prenatal care. Many mothers utilize it to very good effect, which is important in ensuring that their potential baby is healthy, is happy, and that if there are complications, they're able to get them addressed in a medical environment, and that they're not suffering through those alone. In Palestine, obviously, this is not protected, and this is not the case. The next major area that I began to look at was in the terms of violence against women. And this has a couple major ramifications because violence against women is less likely to be addressed in nations struggling to fulfill even the most basic requirements of sovereignty. When the state is struggling to secure its borders, when it's fighting against oppression, when it's fighting against occupation, it's very unlikely to devote precious resources to protecting women when that's not a loud issue or an issue vital to state success. This is the unfortunate truth. It's true across many, many zones of conflict. And so what we found is that in Palestine, domestic and spousal abuse is incredibly prevalent. This is partially due to increased traditionalism in society, which increases the amount of masculinity assigned to men. It also is due to the fact that in times of conflict, when men are seen as fighters and warriors, they're often more likely to express violence against their spouses. So in the West Bank, 29.9% of all women have reported domestic and spousal abuse. This is a really unfortunate number, and it was even higher in the Gaza Strip, where 51% of women reported domestic and spousal abuse. These rates are incredibly high, especially in Gaza, because there is so much violence occurring in the general context. The problem specifically is the state is not working to address these issues in the way that states do have the ability to. They don't have the resources to, they barely have the resources to feed their population, much less resolve domestic abuse issues. Even more unfortunate is the fact that 65.3% of victims of domestic abuse in Palestine say they prefer to remain silent and would not like to report. A lot of this is due to the fact that if they report, oftentimes no progress will be made. The state simply does not have the ability to punish perpetrators of domestic violence, to do research and to collect evidence against abusers, or to bring them to justice overall. So this results in a lack of effective punitive measures and keeps the cycle going. So as we can see, violence against women is incredibly prevalent in Palestine, both due to the fact that it is a conflict society and that increases masculine behavior, but also because the state doesn't have the proper resources to respond to domestic abuse. And finally, I looked at access to contraception and family planning. Now, a major tenet of reproductive rights, especially here in the US, and this is a debate we've been having pretty strongly in Iowa, is whether women have the right to plan when, who, and where they have their families. Kind of for the sake of simplicity, I really just looked at this as a basic tenet of reproductive rights, examined it in the context of Palestine, but this is, again, another issue that's incredibly up for debate. Particularly important is the idea that contraception and family planning does increase the quality of life for women and their families. When women have fewer children, they're far more likely to increase their education. They're far more likely to be better able to take care of the children that they do have. And educated women are far less likely to have large families. So access to contraception and family planning is a major tenet of developed societies, and I argue that in an area of conflict, the state doesn't have the resources to provide either education or the contraceptives themselves that would essentially benefit the state. So this is a statistic I pulled out of my research to share with you. Over 80% of women in the occupied territories believe that there is a need for more information about contraception. Basically what this demonstrates is there is a strong lack of education regarding sexual health, and that this manifests itself in women being unable to control their own reproductive lifestyle. On top of this, a large majority of women in the occupied territories don't even have access to basic forms of contraception. It's very difficult to gain access to forms of sterilization after they have decided that they no longer want to have children. It's difficult to have access to forms of hormonal birth control, such as the pill or the IUD or the implant. And it is just as difficult to get access to barrier forms of contraceptive measures. So what ends up happening is without education as to how to use contraception and without access to the contraceptive resources themselves, many women have more children than they would prefer, and this directly decreases their quality of life, decreases the quality of life for their children, and really has intense manifestations on their lives. So the conclusions that I drew from this research were largely that reproductive rights fall to the wayside. This was not a surprise for me, unfortunately. But particularly in times of conflict, women systematically lack access to basic family planning around the globe. And in Palestine, the need is especially dire. Societal constructions of gender and motherhood have created an environment where women struggle to access freedom from violence, basic health care, contraception, or abortion. And while solutions may seem slow, progress through both a bottom-down and top-up, or a bottom-up and top-down approach, work in tangent to begin to deconstruct the elements of governance and the laws that keep women systematically addressed. So the conclusions that I ended up drawing really focused at the way that the law can impact how women access reproductive rights in society. I developed a thesis that an increase in law is essential to rebuilding the punitive measures that punish domestic abusers and to rebuilding the facilities that provide education, that provide contraception, and that provide reproductive health care for mothers and for infants. And overall, that this is an essential tool in rebuilding Palestine. In terms of how this compares to other major issues, I think that many of the conclusions that we see, the lack of access to certain elements, can be drawn across many societies in conflict and can be applied to women's rights issues even here in the United States. Overall, it's seen that women's rights issues are something that need to be addressed. Palestinian rights issues are something that need to be addressed. And the communities that are fighting against major oppressors and against major powers should look at both in tangent as an intersectional force. Largely they've been separated. This research really brought me into a space of mind where they can connect and we can draw really important and impactful relationships between each other as activists, between each other as academics, and between each other as citizens of this world who are interested in protecting human rights overall. So that's about it. If anybody would like to ask any questions, I'd love to chat. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yes?
So, in your research, did you look at or ask questions about 80% of women who did not have access? If they had the access, how many of them were willing to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did look into those statistics, and generally that really does intersect well with the concerns that we're having about reproductive rights and justice here in the U.S. The statistic that I did pull up on the issue of contraception is that 80% of women in the occupied territories do believe that they have a need for further education about contraception. While there weren't solid numbers about how many would use actual contraceptive methods, even basic understanding is a step forward and really does lead to the healthier lives of women.
I'm very sure for that.
Yes.
The reason I wanted to ask that was for the next question.
Okay.
And the question is, there is a religious component to acceptance of contraception in general, and I was wondering if that was an issue here.
Yeah, it is definitely a slight barrier. However, in Islam, there are many practices and many cultures that do actually promote family planning tactics. So fortunately, there is space in Islam and in the interpretation of the Quran to allow for family planning, which I think is very beneficial. And so, well, in Palestine right now, there isn't a ton of access to contraception, so this debate has largely not been had. I do believe that there is the basis for that debate to be held, and for the conclusion to be that women deserve the right to choose when and where they have their pregnancies. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see significant differences in women's reproductive rights between Gaza and West Bank?
There are significant and unique differences between the two. Part of that is due to the structural elements. So in Gaza, there aren't really the lack of access due to checkpoints, for example. So that research is exclusively applied to the West Bank. In Gaza, the bigger issue is that the facilities that provide healthcare are often destroyed by airstrikes by the Israeli military. So they do lack the healthcare, but it's less due to checkpoints and being unable to drive there, and more about not having the infrastructure. In addition, in terms of domestic abuse rates and access to contraceptives, Gaza does have slightly higher statistics on domestic abuse rates and lower access to contraception. That's primarily just because all goods and services that flow in and out of the territory are controlled by the Israeli Defense Force, which means that, like, if they don't allow contraceptions to be brought into the country, they can't be in the country. On top of that, the violence against women issue is partially just because of the lack of access to the outside world. In Gaza, they have generally less interaction with foreigners and generally less interaction with people outside of their own community, and when borders are so closed off, that is statistically proven to increase domestic abuse rates. The lack of a strong government, Hamas has really taken up the role as a representative of the territory, and their lack of punitive response to domestic abuse has also driven those numbers up as well.
Thank you so much, Mollie.